up? This is Raday, Leavy here, author of the esteemed book. I put that up for you. That's the end of reason. Blacks in the Bible. And we are going to get into chapter 16, which is Praise Gods. Now, in the intro to this chapter, I talk about how there might be a presence of, other quote unquote gods in the Bible. When we look at Elohim, the meaning of it is gods or goddesses, which kind of more closely relates to the Egyptian way of looking at gods. And also when we look at Genesis, we see, he says, let's make human beings like us. And I know I said angels, right? But, it could have been some people think that, it could have been other gods or whatever. And, when they're building the Tower of Babel and he said, let us go down and confuse their language. I kind of assert that, it kind of sounds like he's asking for permission. But it's one of those things where, um, depending on how you interpret it, you can kind of see that there's more than one God in the Bible. And even then, I know I don't want to go too deep into this, but there's even some people that assert that the God of the Old Testament and the God in the New Testament are two different gods. Even in apocryphal book, Jesus states that there's pretty much two different gods. In the Old Testament, God is old and angry, and the new one is all about love and compassion or whatever. Let's see. But one thing that I like to get across is that if you're the type of person that you believe in like one God and all these angels or whatever, and you that's your belief, then you're pretty much going along the same lines as what the ancients believed. Ancient Egypt believed that there's a supreme being, and then there were lesser gods or angels or whatever, like lesser deities. So, and I don't want to go too deep into this, but pretty much you are just as polytheistic as they were, or they were just as monotheistic as you are. It's just a matter of interpretation. Um, let's see, but I kind of want to just get on to the first section in the chapter, which is babbling on. Pretty much this, I want to say this doesn't have much to do with gods. I just kind of want to I want to clarify something. There are people who say that, the Tower of Babel was built, and then after the Tower of Babel, and it was destroyed, everybody kind of scattered along in their lands, and, people went back to Egypt, and, when they went to, when they went to Egypt, then that's when they start building the pyramids or whatever. And if we look at a timeline, right, we see that Nimrod um, was the one who built the city of Babylon. And he was the descendant of Cush or Ethiopia. Now, when we hear the word descendant, that means that there also had to be an ancestor, right? And when we look at the ancestors, we're looking at Cush, and then we're looking at Mizraim, or we're looking at Egypt. So before there was ever a Nimrod, or before there was ever a Babylonia, before there was ever anything of the sort, there was already an Egypt established that was already building a culture, building everything. And along these lines, I feel that it's safe to reason that um, the pyramids and the Sphinx and all that other good stuff that was already built. And like I said, everything comes from something. So when they're looking at building this tower and what it's going to look like and all this other good stuff, I mean, I think that they got a lot of their stuff from Egypt. Like I said, even when we look at even when we look, you take it outside of the Bible, when we start looking historically, um, a lot of people say that, in Mesopotamia, that's where civilization started. That's where, writing systems and everything started. And like I said before, um, first of all, it's all black people anyway. But even then, as they're coming out of Mesopotamia, and they're barely coming out with this writing system, which I still say that a lot of the modern writing system goes back to Egypt or Kush and the Nile. Um, but even then, along those lines, they're barely coming out with writing, and by the time they're coming out with writing in that region, they already Egypt already has pyramids and a dynasty and a sphinx and monuments and stuff like that. They're already coming out with this, but I know I do a better job of explaining this in the book, but it's just something I want to touch on. The next thing I want to get into is raw power. Pretty much, I want to just read a verse right here, Malachi 4:2. But unto you that fear my name shall thee the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness arise with healing in his wings. Pretty much, the first thing I want to talk about is obviously the sun god Ra, which is probably one of the uh, probably one of the more famous gods of Egypt. And as we get into this thing, and I just want to read it again, that the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings. If you look at um, the one of the symbols for Ra, it's a winged disc. It's literally wings on a sun. So, do you do a little Google search or whatever right now if you need to. Go on ahead, click a new tab, look that up. It was already in Egypt. But some people say, well, it's not the sun as in the sun or whatever. It's really talking about Jesus or whatever. And I got some Jesus for that ass too. We're gonna get in that later. But I kind of want to just get into some of this stuff. The next section after that is Terah or Terah, and Terah is Abraham's father. And I don't want to just sit here and be like, oh, well, look, there's Ra everywhere. You can see Ra here and this and that and da da da. Like, if it's important, I want to point it out. And the name Terah means place in the desert. And obviously Ra, sun god, heat, Terah, place in the desert. I mean, just use your like elementary school intuitive skills to try to put that together, please. Um, and when we look at Abraham, that's the next section. Abraham. Um, if we notice, it's not until he gets out of Egypt that he first gets financially blessed. He gains the concept of giving a tenth of what he had, which is the precursor to tithing. This is where he got Ishmael's mother, who was the only woman who can bear him a child at the time. This is where he got the concept of circumcision, and this is where he got his after he came out is where he got his name changed. But one thing I wanted to touch on was circumcision. Um, it's one of those things where uh, how do I say it? I'm just pretty much gonna assert this. Abraham had to have been indoctrinated into the priesthood of Egypt. Before Abraham got there, there was no, how do I put it? There was no Hebrew faith. They didn't believe anything. There wasn't any structure. There was no name for God. There was no belief. There was no there was nothing. There were no customs. There were nothing. They kind of just borrowed or whatever from anybody that was around them. And it wasn't until he got out of Egypt that he got blessed and he got everything. And when we talk about the concept of circumcision, I just think it's funny how people say, well, yeah, Abraham, that was the first person to perform the surgery of circumcision. And to that, I would say that's ludicrous. So you're gonna tell me that as God, you are going to appoint 100-year-old man, 100+ years on this earth, somebody who's never had any recorded surgical skills, and you want him to take a blade to a child's penis and cut skin, and he's never seen this, never done this. This is the first time it's ever been done, and you're just gonna let that happen? Really? That's a no. Like that, you are ludicrous to think that. Um, So no, he had to learn this, and I even have a picture in the book of, Egyptians performing circumcision. So, there you go, some sexuality for you, I guess. Um, but even then, when we look at even in Sarah and Abraham, before their names, it was Sarai and Abram. I murdered that, but and it's customary that, when you go through a lot of these initiations or a lot of these rites or whatever, you get a new name. I mean, you even see that with a lot of these like Greek fraternities or whatever. Like, you go through and then all of a sudden you become like Big Brother, Megatron or whatever. Like, you get a certain name, and this is where it comes from. You go through an initiation. A lot of times you get a new name, and you get this knowledge. And even then, I think maybe I'm reaching here, but I think it's funny that Abraham's name and Sarah's name are kind of accented to kind of like project the Ra in their name, like Sarah. Like, even then, Sarah means like son of God. I just want to put that out there, or child of God, and Abraham. But even then, um, we're gonna get into the next one, which is God of Hagar. And this is probably one of the most important sections. I think it's probably one of the most fun that I'm gonna have to talk about. But pretty much the story goes. Um, you already know the story. Abraham and Sarah, whatever, they're beefing. They finally split, or not split. She runs away into the desert. Um, all that other good stuff. I think I went over this before. If not, just you know what this is. But I think it's funny that, people say, well, what's the name of God? And, is it Yahweh or whatever, blah, 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 blah. Well, before God was known as Yahweh or Yahuwah or whatever the hell people want to talk about it nowadays, he was known as Ra in the Bible before Jehovah or any of that stuff. And let me just take it to you. Exodus 6:2-3. And God spake unto Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and I appeared unto Abraham and unto Isaac and unto Jacob by the name God Almighty, El Shaddai. But my name, Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever, was not known to them. So he didn't reveal his name to any of these people, which I think is funny. Um, when we look at Hagar, and she was out in the desert, and she's crying out to God. God responded to her, right? And says, gave her a prophecy about her son or whatever. And she got so excited that she named the place Bir Lahoi Roy, which means God sees me, right? Which is interesting. When we look at this in the Strong's Concordance, the number is 883, which means well of a living one, my seer, right? And when we look at and this, it breaks down a little bit more. When we look at beer, it breaks down to 875 to 874, which means it means pit, well, dig. That's what it means. And then lahai, it breaks down literally mean to live. But the main thing we look at is Roy. If you look at Roy, the Strong's Definition Concordance, uh, if you look at number 7203, uh, it's spelled R-O, or excuse me, ROEI, which means a seer. This particular word breaks down into SE 7200, which is spelled RAAH, Ra. Like, so here she is. She's crying out to God, the same God that responds to Abraham. I mean, if you're monotheistic, right? The same God that responds to Abraham is the same God that responds to her, and she takes it upon herself to call this God Ra, and this is before any of this stuff. And she is from Egypt, where they have Ra worship. You know, I mean, it's that simple. It's the same place where Abraham got all the stuff that he got. all of his blessings, all all that other good stuff, his knowledge. This is where it came from. So that's something for you. And we're gonna go into the next section, which is Gomorrah or Gomer Ra, and pretty much it's that simple. You already know Sodom, Gomorrah, horrible towns or whatever, just involved in you know bad acts or whatever. And we look at Gomer. Gomer is the son of Japheth, whose descendants have been shown to inhabit what is known Europe. And it also says Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem with Canaan as their servants. So, we're starting to see pretty much this is the white folks in the region, I guess. And uh, it just is what it is. When we look at, Gomer Ra, like Egypt is kind of like what America is, that cultural influence is spread. So I kind of think that this might have been an attempt for them to, even then it says they had a lot of, orgiastic rites and stuff like that. And, I think maybe a part of that may have been due to them trying to, uh, get some of these customs down or whatever. But, in any way, they're wiped out. So we can't ask them. And then the next, I just want to jump to the next section, which is Israel and Rachel's child. Now, when we look at, if you look at the story of Israel or Jacob or whatever and Rachel, then we know that he spent maybe about 20 some odd years living with Rachel and Leah and the family or whatever. Finally gets what he needs to get, gets his wives or whatever, and he leaves. And as it turns out, Laban goes and pursues Rachel, and it turns out that Rachel had gods or whatever, had the gods with her, and had Laban's gods, and he returned them and all that other good stuff. Kind of get into the book. I think it's Genesis 31:22 through 42. Going ahead and brush up on that. And you ask, well, why was he so why was he so angry? I mean, and what I think, let's see, is that when we look in ancient times, women are a lot of times known as seers. I don't know if you saw 300, but they talk about the oracles of Delphi or whatever, and they're all women and everything like that. Well, there really is a spiritual aspect. I'm not sure if it really was like that in Greece, but it was certainly like that in Egypt and other parts of Africa. Women were known as the seers. That I mean, we know this. Women are just more intuitive than men are overall. And it's one of those things where I feel that Laban and his gods kind of worked in concert with Rachel. And I explain this a lot better in the book, but I don't want to just sit here and just read through the whole thing. Um, but along these lines, obviously they look at the gods for good luck and strength and everything like that. And so I can understand on that front why he wants him back. And I also feel that this is probably one of the main reasons why he tricked Jacob in the first place. Was because like the original plan uh, was for Jacob to only work, a certain amount of time and then get Rachel. But then at the end of the deal or whatever, he says, "Oh, well, we get we get Leah. You got to get Leah because she's the oldest or whatever." Kind of tricked him. And I think another main reason for that is that Rachel was probably one of these seers. She's probably very intuitive. And to kind of add along this, like she was the one who took the idols with her. So she had a special connection with these things. And another thing I want to point out is that uh, Jacob had no problem with these idols. He had no problem with these gods. God didn't have any problem with these idols. God didn't have any problem with these gods, oddly enough. And even then, Jacob spent about 20 years in this dude's household. 20 years with his daughters, 20 years with the cattle, 20 years with all this other good stuff. So, I mean, it's one of those things where I feel that Jacob, maybe he how do I say it? He was probably worshiping these gods as well. I mean, we look at Israel. Half the battle was them turning to other gods and all this other kind of good stuff, and it would make no sense. It would certainly be in the area of reason to kind of assume that maybe he did the same thing. If nothing else, then he was certainly very comfortable with these gods, whatever kind of gods they were. He was very comfortable with them. Um, and and I say all that to say, well, even then, they had a lot of disputes. They disputed about women, they disputed about cattle, they disputed about a lot of things, but they never disputed about gods. Which which kind of leads me to my next point. When Rachel um when Rachel was pregnant and she was going through her stuff, and uh, she died or whatever, she named her son Ben Oni. But the name was changed to Benjamin. And if you look at Ben Oni, then it means son of my sorrow. But um, if I get that you might be going through some stuff, but why would you name your son of, like, why would you name your child son of my sorrow? It didn't make sense to me. But when you look at um, Oni, it's very similar to the word on or own or one. And On is a was a city in Egypt. It was a successful, and when you look it up in the SC, I have a lot of numbers here, but if you look it up in the SC, pretty much it breaks down into successful building, power, wealth, force, goods, might, strength, and substance. So, we look at this and we talk about gods. What kind of gods would be in the region? Well, obviously we're talking about the subject of Ra. We're talking about the influence of Egypt, the most powerful force in the land right now. It's not out of assumption to think that maybe some of the gods were in the likeness of Ra. Even when Abraham took a lot of his wealth or whatever from Egypt, they didn't just give him gold. They didn't just give him gold bars. They gave him a lot of gold coins and gold statues, and a lot of that had a lot of Egyptian iconography on there. Um, and I know I explained this a little bit better in the book, but pretty much if you break down his name, it could literally mean son of my effort and success. But obviously, if you're one of those people who don't really understand, and you kind of think, well, son of my sorrow, well, of course I'm going to change his name. I don't want son of my sorrow. That'll be his name. Like, but I like I said, I explained it a lot better in the book. But I'm gonna go to the next section. Or because of on, it could quite simply mean that pretty much she said, son of the city of Ra. you know. But we're just gonna get on to the next section, which is whew, Zapnath Paneah. Yeah, that's say that 4 times fast. Those people know this man is Joseph, and when we look at Joseph, um, I'm just going to throw out the assertion that he had to be a part of the priestly order as well. When we look at, once you get involved, once you get through some things, you get a new name, and he got a new name, and he got a wife, and he got all this other good stuff. And, uh, I think that, even though, and I'll just read from the book right here, although he was intuitive, it would make no sense to let someone become second in command in the most powerful nation on earth without any formal education. We look at the Egyptian mystery schools, the best schooling, probably ever, certainly in the ancient world. Pretty much, it's like, okay, you got the gift, but you need the knowledge, right? You need to know how Egypt works. You got to know our customs. You got to know these things. And even then, it's one of those things where you have to assimilate in order to fully be understood by the people, because at the same time it is a kingdom. It's not um, how do I say it? It's one of those things where the people need to have faith in you as well. So they're looking at somebody who's second in command that doesn't understand who they are, or where they come from, or what they believe, or customs, or whatever. They just interpreted a dream. That's not good enough. But if you see somebody who looks like you, who's been through the priesthood, has a wife that's on it or whatever, and even then, when we look at the wife, she probably was a priestess as well. To be that high up, to be that well connected, she would be involved in all this other good stuff as well. And even then, you're gonna want your second in command to have a woman who's also strong. Like, you don't want, I mean, that's the thing. Like, you look at someone like, I don't know, Barack Obama, like, and you see Michelle Obama, like, you see that just fits. Or like Bill and Hillary Clinton or whatever, it just fits. You're not gonna see like, that's why you see Barack Obama with like Michelle than K Michelle. I mean, there's no offense to K Michelle, I like the music or whatever, but it is what it is. Um, man, even when we get down to his wife, her father, um, when we look at him, his name is Potipharah, and he is a priest from the city of On. And when we go back to the last section regarding Rachel and On or whatever, we can see that, at least the Bible hints at, Ra worship in the city of On, that type of stuff. So it kind of brings a little bit of validity to everything that we talked about earlier. With that, see, is there anything else? Is there anything else? No. We're gonna go on to Ra Moses, and really quick, I'm not gonna go over that, or the first part anyway. But when we look at Moses, he spent 40 years, in the house of the Pharaoh, and when we look at that, when we look at mystery schools in Egypt, they take about 40 years. I mean, do some independent research, but it takes about 40 years to grasp all the knowledge. And when we get to this, excuse me, when we get to this, even his name at the very beginning, when we talk about when you get initiated, you get a name change and everything like that. And when we think about baptism, a lot of people think that, baptism, that's all a Christian thing, or that started with the Jews or whatever. Not really. I mean, even when we look in the Bible, it was Moses's Egyptian mother that pulled him out of the water. In fact, when she pulled him out of the water, she gave him a new name. And obviously, look, if we look at the concept of baptism, you're one person, you go in, you come out a different person, and it's just, you come out reborn or whatever. This is essentially what we're seeing here. I'm thinking that this is an initiation into, some rites or whatever, one of those things where, now we duck you in and bring you up, and now you're one of us. Um, and even then, Moses' name himself, I mean, if we're looking at the biblical text, isn't even a Hebrew name. It was given to him by his Egyptian mother. It was a rename. Moses was not his original name. He had another name. And once she pulled him out of the water, once she baptized him and, I guess initiated him, she named him Moses, which means brought him out of the water. So, with that, we can kind of, and even then, do some research. Um, I'm just gonna say baptism started in Egypt. I know that, and there's some reference in the Bible to that as well. Um, let's see. And, when we look at Acts 7:22, it states that he was learned in all of the ways in the Egyptians. I think there's another verse or whatever that says that as well, but he was learned in all of the ways. So he knew all this stuff. He knew, I mean, he spent 40 years there. He was a smart guy, you know, and, this is going to carry over into the next thing, because here's the thing, right? When he goes to implement a lot of this stuff that we're going to kind of get into. Where's his frame of reference? His frame of reference is in Egypt. His frame of reference isn't in Canaan or Israel or whatever. As far as that's concerned, those don't even exist yet. His only frame of reference is Egypt. He was learned in the ways of the who? The Egyptians. No one else. So you're gonna tell me that he has all this Egyptian stuff, and as soon as he get all right, I'm just gonna discredit all that. 40 years of my life just wasted. All this knowledge, everything that I've gained, I'm just gonna gone. You know. Um, but when we look at the word tabernacle, it means dwelling place, and we know that it was on the mount that God gives Moses the instructions to assemble the tabernacle. My thing, uh, you got to use your common sense here. If you're one of those people, you have to have a frame of reference. Like this is God's dwelling place, right? And to have somebody that has no concept of what a tabernacle is, just try to build you a tabernacle, that would be that would just that would oh my God, you know. I mean, it would be irresponsible, and this is the same God of the flood of extinction. This is somebody you don't want to piss off. You want to know what you're doing, and you need to have a frame of reference to build him a stable, suitable home that he likes, or else, I mean, he's the God of the Old Testament. We know what happens. Um, there's little room for ignorance. So, and obviously, I'd say, and I say, do your research a little bit on this too, but that knowledge came from Egypt. They already had tabernacles, they already had arcs and all that other good stuff. He had to have seen this stuff in order to know what this was. And when we look at another thing I wanted to point out, when we look at the cherubim that are supposed to be placed on the top of the ark, you got to understand that he had to have known what a cherubim was. If you don't know what a cherubim was, it's the pretty much the angels, and they face forward or whatever, and they're symbolic. They need to protect the ark, and it's like if he's never heard this before, and God says, well, I want you to put two women on top of this golden box, and they're gonna have wings, and they're going to face each other, and all. Like, what? Like, I guess that sounds weird to me. Like, what's the significance, right? And going back to the real name of Ramses, Asur Ma'at Ra Septepen Ra Ramesu Mariamin Ma'at. That is a god of Egypt. And her name, well, she's the goddess of truth, justice, righteousness, balance, order, all that other good stuff. Like, all the positive aspects of God is what she represents. And like I said, I know I stepped a little bit outside of the biblical boundaries, but I mean, just right now, go to the next tab, do a little Google search on Ma'at, Egypt, or whatever. You'll know this. And if you look at the image of her, it's a cherub. It's the same thing. So, we go down a little bit further, and we notice that uh, he implements the concept of tithing. But this was already in effect in Egypt long before. And some say, well, Joseph, and when all that other good stuff, they tithe the fifth or whatever, and all this other good stuff. But this was instilled in the time of Abraham. Once he got out, how do I say? It's not necessarily an Egyptian thing. It was just a thing of the day. When he tithed gave his money to Melchizedek. Melchizedek, it was one of the priests, or one of the king priests or whatever of the day, and it just was what it was. But when we look at the specific principle of tithing, tithing was made as a way to provide food for the priests, food, and give them a place to stay, because you got to eat, you got to have a pot to piss in and a window to throw it out of. So That's what this was. It was never about money. And for those of you that say, well, they didn't have money. Well, here's the thing. They had a system. They had When we talk about money, these are the offerings just for money. They had trespass offerings, dedication offerings, redemption offerings for men, women, and children. They also had yearly temple taxes. They had temple restoration offerings. They had free will offerings, um, and voluntary contributions. Like they had, like when they needed money, they can get money, but the tithe itself was it was just food. And I know that somebody's spider sense or whatever is thinking like, oh my God, we could talk about that, but we need to stay on track. Um, let's see. I'm just gonna gloss over that. And then we're gonna go into the next section, which is Solomon, because we gotta. I've been talking for far too long. Still got 2 seconds to go. And if we look at Solomon, at least in the English whatever translation or whatever, we look at Solomon, and his first name is Sol, which is soul, and soul means son. It comes from like the Greek or Latin or whatever, and soul means son. And it's funny how he was known as the most enlightened of his day. Well, here we go. Well, where did that come from? And I say it came from Egypt. When we look at his wife or whatever, when we look at how do I say it? When we look at that woman that he craved and loved and all this other stuff, some people think it was Sheba or whatever, or Candace or what. I think that it was Pharaoh's daughter. And here's why, is because it wasn't until he married her, it wasn't until he got his connection with Egypt, it wasn't until any of this stuff that he got what he needed to get. Um, and it's one of those things where, like I say, everything comes from somewhere, you know, and I think it's one of those things where if you marry her, then you get access to a lot of knowledge. And I think, even then, when he prayed for knowledge, when he prayed for wisdom, you think he just woke up one day and he was just like, I'm wise. Like that shit doesn't happen. Excuse my language, but it doesn't happen. You know, everything comes from somewhere. You need to learn something. You need to, and it's one of those things where it's like, wow, okay, well, I'm gonna set you up. This is how the universe works. I'm gonna set you up with this person. This person's gonna get you where you need to get to. And that person was Pharaoh's daughter. And when we talk about the temple and everything like that, he was so wise about the temple. We look at 2 Samuel 7:6. God states, "I have I have never lived in I have never lived in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day." Well, if you think about it, he says, "I haven't lived since that time." So, where was God living in Egypt? you know, it gives the impression that God had a place to stay in Egypt, but left them. I mean, that's why they had the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, or whatever that goes along with them. It was a portable home, it was a mobile home. And this is, Solomon saying, I want to give you a permanent home. And he says, well, I haven't had a permanent home since Egypt, you know. Um, let's see. And I think that honestly, if we want to think about the temple designs and all this other kind of good stuff, that a lot of that, as far as a lot of knowledge, it would have came from Egypt. Like there was no, even when we look at Greeks and Romans or whatever, there has been nothing in the ancient world as far as monuments and gods or whatever is concerned that is um, that's on the level of Egypt and temples and everything like that. I mean, people have done some impressive things, but not on that level. Not when you get into this stuff. It's just deep. But let's see. Even then, some people say that he got a lot of his inspiration from like Mesopotamia and all that other good stuff. And like I keep telling you, and the Bible keeps telling you, um, if it was Middle Eastern or Mesopotamian culture or whatever, like I said, originally it was all black anyway. Well, they were influenced by Mesopotamia. Well, Mesopotamia was influenced by Africa. So even then, it doesn't really matter. And even then, a lot of their a lot of the stuff that did directly influence did come from Egypt. It did come from Africa, and even then, when we look at the seraphim, that are supposed to protect the temple and stand there and all that other good stuff, like a seraphim is, and I know I'm getting probably some of the terminology mixed up in my haste or whatever here, but seraphim is pretty much a sphinx with wings. Well, where did the sphinx? Where's the first time we seen that? Egypt, that big ass monument. Like, that's pretty much that could be what, 10,000 years old, 10, 12,000 years old. Like, it's that deep. um we're gonna go, and here's the thing: a lot of people say that Hiram was how do I say, a master architect or whatever. Hiram from Tyre and all this, or Tyree. I probably murdered that name. Excuse me. Uh, but from this place, and here's the thing: the Bible says that they were responsible for a lot of the materials and a lot of the labor force for the construction for the temple. But when we look at this thing, right, and here's the thing: like, I want to give credit to Egypt, because Egypt is pretty much said, it's noticed. How do I say it? Not noticed. It's talked about pretty much in the beginning of the Bible. And then when we look at Tyre or Tyre or whatever, it doesn't even appear until like the later part of Joshua. And even then, when we look at that, it's known as a strong city, whatever that means. It's known as a strong city, but Egypt was known as a powerful, dominating nation that had architecture, structure, all that other good stuff. I mean, it doesn't even really pale in comparison. Um, let's see, is this book history? And even then, as this book, history, and the Bible itself can attest to, Egypt has been very generous with its knowledge and its services to everyone. So it's not out of the question to assert that the people of Tyre were subject to the same learned ways of these great people. Matter of fact, that was one of Egypt, and some say, if you even get into some of John Henrik Clark's stuff, that's one of Africans' things, is that we're too accepting. We're too accepting of everybody. We're too giving of everybody. And I'm not saying we need to shut down. No, I'm just saying historically, your history, then this is what it is. But even as far as even in Tyre or Tyre or any of these Mesopotamian or Middle Eastern cultures or whatever, I'm just gonna say it. As one can tell, there are really no great architectural findings in Israel or Tyre that date back to this time period. There's none. I mean, some say, well, the Temple Mount or whatever, and da 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 da. Like, aside from the remains of the Temple Mount established by King Herod centuries later, we wouldn't have even known that this thing even existed. Um, Even then, I mean, there's little to no evidence that any of this stuff ever happened, right? And some say, well, that's because that's because of the destruction. God said there would come fire and burn and destruction. Well, Egypt had the same thing. Matter of fact, we have records of people coming in and cutting off noses and the Sphinx and all this other good stuff. Like, we know this. It's a historical, not just a biblical or mythical fact. It's a historical fact. This happened. But yet the pyramids are still there, Sphinx is still there, everything is still there, for the most part. Even then, when we look at the pyramids, these things were encased in like marble or granite or whatever. These things used to be like big ass white triangles, you know. And when we look at that, uh, you know, how do I say it? It was almost like, oh man, that's what I oof. But I remember hearing somewhere that it was almost like looking at, like, if you look from space and looking down at the pyramids or whatever, it looked like a star from the space looking down, like as above, so below, law of one of the universal laws, correspondence, all that other good stuff. But now I'm getting into a lot of esoteric stuff, and I'll get on that a little bit later. But the last section is Jeroboam, and pretty much the golden calf. I went into a little bit, but we can just kind of see that, even in the latter times of Israel's reign or Judah's reign or whatever, we could see that Egypt had a lot of influence. But with that, I've spent a lot of time talking. And we're going to go on to the next one, which is chapter 17, Wonder Years. We're going to talk about, this is when we start talking about Jesus. This is when it starts getting a little heavy. So, hope you're ready for it. I'm going to be ready for it. With that, I'm out. This is Standard Reason, Blacks in the Bible. I'm the author. I'm Raday, Leavy, Twitter, Facebook, all that other good stuff. And with that, I will see you. Peace.